It's now my great pleasure to welcome... Is this working? Yeah, okay. That was my way of saying, shh. It doesn't appear to be working, because everyone's still talking, even though I'm talking. So it's my great pleasure now to welcome our lunchtime keynote speaker, Ryan Avent, who is senior editor and economics correspondent with The Economist. He's risen up through the ranks of The Economist, ending up as news editor from 2015. Author of many interesting articles and books. Most recently, and perhaps most relevantly, his book, The Wealth of Humans, Work, Power, and Status in the 21st Century. Ryan is someone who's thinking and writing a lot at the intersection of public policy, economics, and some of the issues around power that we've been touching on today. And so it's with great pleasure that I'll introduce Ryan, who's going to speak to you for 15 minutes or so, and then we'll have 10 minutes of Q&A. So please join me in welcoming Ryan.
Thank you, Richard. Am I appropriately amplified at this point? Can everyone hear? I'll take that as a yes. You guys all busy eating your lunch. Move it a bit up. How's that? Any better? No? Well, thank you very much, Richard. It's very nice to be here. As a journalist, I get to get up here and make sweeping statements without necessarily showing my work, which is fun for me and hopefully interesting for you and a bit of a departure from the rest of the proceedings. But as I was thinking about what I wanted to talk about here today, I was thinking to myself that if we are interested in shoring up and enlarging and reestablishing a strong middle class, and we very much ought to be, that it's useful to recall how it was that we ended up with this strong middle class in the first place. And this will be history that I know a lot of you are familiar with, but it's worth reflecting on and considering. If we want to think about the golden age of the middle class in America and across much of the rich world, we're going to be thinking about the period from sort of the 1950s to the 1970s. This is an era where there was rapid, broad-based economic growth. We had a very compressed income distribution. There were high levels of intergenerational mobility. It was not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but in terms of delivering sort of egalitarian prosperity and opportunity, it was kind of the high watermark, I think, in a lot of ways. And that's interesting to me, and it's useful to think about how we got there because it wasn't at all an inevitable outcome. It wasn't something that was baked into the cake when we started to develop the key technologies of the Industrial Revolution. In fact, it took quite a lot of luck. It took quite a lot of work, quite a lot of doing. And so, what were the key components? What were the key sort of pillars of social infrastructure that allowed us to develop this successful middle class? One certainly would be education. You think about the massive public investment that went into education to get us to the point where we were in the decades after the Second World War. There was the push first for universal primary education, then for secondary education. In America, in the first half of the 20th century, you had the high school movement, which increased the number of young people going to secondary school from about 10% or so at the beginning of the century to 75% by the start of the Second World War, which is just a phenomenal increase in the human capital of the workforce. You had the creation of lots of institutions of technical research. I think one of my favorite pieces of American policy in the country's history is the Morrill Act, which produced the land-grant university systems, one of which I'm an alma mater. Is my alma mater. And these were just phenomenally, I think, ambitious institutions in that they were specifically charged with developing new and useful techniques in agriculture and manufacturing, and then also making sure those techniques were diffused out across the people actually doing the work across the countryside. And then, of course, you had things like the GI Bill, which I think is one of the pillars of the post-war middle class that allowed millions of service members to go and get a higher education, to get some sort of post-secondary training, and to set the stage for the rapid growth of the post-war period. So you had all of these massive pieces of public investment in education, That was just one component, though, of how we got to the point where we were in the 50s and 60s and 70s. If you look at the distribution of population at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, it was dramatically different from where we were in the post-war decades. There was a huge increase in urbanization. Urbanization alone did not lead to a high level, a high quality of life for the middle class, though. It took quite a lot of additional investment in public infrastructure and housing to get people out of slums and tenements, in water and sewer utilities, so we could get rid of the sort of the terrible diseases that made cities such killing grounds in the 19th century, in public transport. And it was because of all this, these sort of public works that we were able to generate that mid-century quality of life for so many people. And then, I think if we think about the composition of the middle class in the decades after the Second World War, it's clear there that a fair share of the workers were white-collar professionals. It's been a growing piece of the middle class over the second half of the 20th century. But there was also quite a large share of people in that group that were blue-collar workers, semi-skilled and earning good wages. And the fact of the matter is that those jobs didn't become like that all on their own, that it took decades upon decades of organization on labor, of political mobilization, to build a labor union movement. And that labor union movement was important, both because it negotiated directly with firms. If you're thinking about pillars of the post-war middle class, certainly you want to think about things like the Treaty of Detroit. But also because it was there as a political force during other progressive reform movements that supported other contributors to the development of the middle class. There were other things that government did as well. There was sort of aggressive antitrust enforcement at times. There was the setting of standards, the funding of research, and the list goes on and on. But I think the important thing to remember is that there was a vast amount of public reform, public investment that went into the construction of this post-war sort of golden age. Now, what would the rich world have looked like in the absence of all of that? What would America have looked like if we hadn't been able to do all of that? I think it would have been much more unequal, certainly. It would have been less educated, less urbanized, quite a bit poorer, perhaps quite a bit more politically volatile or unstable. I think if you're looking for comparators, you might think about other New World countries that were land and resource rich, but where the states didn't necessarily develop the same capacities and make the same public investments. And you think about large Latin American economies, and those places aren't, they're not awful places to be, but they're certainly a far cry from the kind of economy that we were proud to have in sort of mid-century America. And I think also you may see echoes of the modern economy just a bit. As we think about those sorts of dynamics, rising inequality, people not living in the places where the most productive, best paid jobs are. It seems clear to me that we are moving in a direction that's not necessarily one we'd like to see. So what does this experience tell us? Well, I think you might say it doesn't tell us a whole lot. We know that it was important that we invested in education. We know it was important that we made our cities habitable and developed worker protections and built a welfare state. That was all really good that we did that. But now we've done it, and so whatever else comes down the road, we're going to be prepared to handle, we're equipped to take on these new challenges. And I think that probably just doesn't hold up in a few ways. And if you look at the economic trends over the past few decades, if you look at the atrophication of the middle class, which is sort of a focus of this initiative, if you look at the diverging performance of many regions of the economy relative to the kind of superstar cities that are increasingly inaccessible to all but a rich few, if you look at declining life expectancy, which is sort of a shocking development these days, it seems clear to me that the institutions that we had developed to manage industrialization and the associated technological change of past eras aren't doing the job we would want them to do. And I think actually that's completely to be expected, that there's really no reason to think that a set of technologies and a set of sort of production processes that evolved in one context would have the same effects on society or demand the same sorts of government interventions at all. And I think we should expect that there's going to need to be radical reform, radical updating of these pieces of social infrastructure. And the more optimistic, I think, and hopeful you are about the potential of new technologies, be they AI or robotics or genetic engineering, the more you think those things are capable of transforming society for the better, the more radical you need to expect changes in our social infrastructure to be. So if we think that's right, then what are the lessons we ought to draw from this past experience? Well, I think the first one is that the changes in social infrastructure, the development of the welfare state and so on that led us to the post-war middle class, these weren't simply incidental things that happened along the way, that happened as industrialization unfolded. They weren't simply nice things that we were able to afford because we had new and more productive technologies. They were actually critical contributors to the success of the post-war economy and to our ability to unlock the potential of new technologies. When I'm asked about the digital revolution and what's going to happen, the two questions I get most often are, one, how do we prevent this from doing grave damage to workers? And two, if these technologies are so powerful, why aren't we seeing rapid growth yet because of them? And I think really those questions are two sides of the same coin. It's because we are not necessarily making the investments that we ought to be making to allow people to benefit maximally from these new technologies that we aren't realizing the growth that we would like to see from these new technologies. Along those lines, I think we need to allow ourselves to be more open to radical ideas. And I think that a lot of people, having watched politics in America unfold over the last decade or so would say we're there. we're very much there when as we're thinking about kind of ripping up the old global trading system, as we think about some of the policy proposals that leading Democratic candidates have. But to be perfectly honest, I'm sort of a little bit bemused when I see leading Democrats arguing about the virtues of free college. Relative to the sorts of things that we managed during the Industrial Revolution, relative to the colossally ambitious and optimistic policies like the Morrill Acts, which led to the land-grant institutions and so on. The Morrill Acts were signed in 1862. I kind of love this. Over the summer of 1862, Lincoln signed into law the first Morrill Act, setting up these institutions, a bill to finance the Transcontinental Railroad, and the Homestead Act, which ended up giving massive amounts of Western land to some 2 million American households. That's radicalism. That's boldness. That's the sort of thing that sets the stage for an egalitarian economic revolution to come. And I think that we're nowhere near getting to the point where we're really allowing ourselves to consider such things. Now, having said that, if you may agree that we do indeed need to think more boldly about the sorts of things that we can do to unlock the potential of the digital revolution. But we all read the newspapers every day, and we all know what the government in Washington is like. We all know that however successful a Democratic candidate may be, for example, that when they win the presidency, they're going to potentially face a hostile Senate, a court system that may not be willing to uphold a lot of the sort of bold proposals that they'd like to enact. And that's assuming that they can get an agreement within their own party on what ought to be done. So there's just an extraordinary amount of dysfunction. Why even bother thinking about radicalism? Why not just focus on incrementalism and hope we can make small changes along the way? And I think this probably gets to the most important lesson of the creation of the American middle class and the American sort of economic growth story, which is that it isn't in a lot of ways fundamentally about economics. It isn't necessarily about policy, but really it's about power. It's about developing a politically mobilized working class that is capable of exerting power on the national political stage. And that's a hugely important development for a few reasons. And I think that if we were able to replicate it, it would in the future be important for a few reasons. One is that you need, I think, to have that sort of power on the other side of the table when you're dealing with pay negotiations, when you're negotiating about how technology is going to be used, about what the benefits situation is going to be. Within firm negotiations, you need to have unions there to make that case. You also need it in the political arena. I think there's an awful lot of people now who've sort of decided that the way to get Nancy Pelosi to do what you want to do is to tweet at her a lot. And I think fundamentally that's not going to work. That in fact you need to be able to marshal political resources to say that, we need you to spend money this way, and our support is going to be contingent on you taking these necessary steps. But beyond that, technological change, especially revolutionary technological change, raises a lot of really important societal questions that go beyond economics, questions about what we think a high quality of life is or ought to be like, what we think ethical uses of new technologies are, how we want technologies in business to interact with our political system. And these are the sorts of things that need to be resolved through a broad and open social discussion. And I think the historical record shows that it's difficult to have those broad and open historical discussions without institutions in place to aggregate and amplify the voices of working people. If you don't have those sorts of things, you have a very incomplete discussion. You have a very problematic discussion. And no offense to the people gathered here, you have a lot of elites in rooms talking about what they think is going to be useful when in fact they may not quite have the answer. And so I think, when I think back to the book that I wrote in 2016 about how technology was going to interact with labor market institutions, I sort of chuckle ruefully because I kind of got to the point where I thought, what we really need are modern labor unions. But sadly, they don't exist anymore. And of course, because I've had all this economic training and indeed experience at The Economist, it seems quite likely that if we did have them, they'd bungle things anyway. But over the past 3 years, as I've thought more and more about it, I've come to the conclusion that really the creation of the American middle class in the 20th century, and indeed I think the creation of most of the things about our modern economy and modern society that we hold dear, it really would not have been possible without a mobilized working class, without organized labor, without that voice in the discussion. And I know it's quite difficult to imagine how we could recreate that, but that doesn't mean it's not indispensable. All right, I'll leave it there and take some questions.
Yet, if that's okay, just to get more voices in the room. So I'm going to take the gentleman here behind me. Is there is the handheld microphone available somewhere? So why don't, all right, you come up there and do that, and then I'll push the button. There you go.
Is it on? Oh, right.
Yeah, it is now, yeah.
Hey, Ryan. My name's Alex Dadich with Fahy, based in Eastern Kentucky, and sometimes I get the pleasure of coming over to Brookings when I'm around and I'm not in the region. And sometimes I've been a little critical of lacking the perspective here, but I just want to say that I'm really impressed with this event today, and particularly with your remarks and a frank discussion about political power, because if you go out into places like where I work, you see how important and what a difference it makes. So I just want to thank you and comment positively on the event today. Thank you.
I called on you specifically because you always attack us, and I wanted to be even-handed. So I don't know what to do now. I'll go to the gentleman over there, and then the gentleman over there, and then we'll maybe come back to Ryan. Yeah.
Ryan, thank you so much. My name is Danny. I work for the OECD here in Washington, D.C. Very interesting to hear you mentioned about needing a broad and open social discussion, taking into account the huge polarization, not just here in the US, but also I'm Irish myself. We don't have it too much, but in Western Europe and just the Western world, and huge polarization and us versus them, and there's real tension between groups that actually should be working together because they're in the same boat, but because you wear a red tie, I wear a blue tie, whatever, red socks, blue socks, how do you get that discussion? How and can take it into account disinformation tactics, taking into account the virality of fake news and false information? How do we go about that? Whether is it through government? Is it through private sector? How does one do that? Thank you.
Thank you. And over here. Yep, gentleman there. Press the button in the middle. There you go. And then speak right into it.
Yes, my name is Roger Chetty. I work with private equity in the technology sector. And I wanted to go back to something you said in the introductory part of your comments, and that is, in addition to the distribution of wealth within societies, one of the things that has been striking is the geographic distribution of the benefits of technological development for hundreds of years. And for instance, you mentioned Argentina, and there was every reason to believe at one point that Argentina would be an economic superpower and the United States would be a second-class economic power, and yet the reverse has happened. And if you look at the Western Balkans and the Alpine sections of Europe, you would say that the explanation for the vast differences in distribution of wealth and technology and the benefits of technology, it's not explicable through geology, because oftentimes you're looking at geologically similar. It's not the difference of ethnicity, because oftentimes it's very similar, if not identical, ethnic stock. And to bring it down to the United States, you can find sections of the northwest part of the United States and Appalachia, which have vastly different experiences, even though they are geologically identical, ethnically identical, and yet what accounts for the geographic distribution?
Okay.
And I think if a Martian were ever coming down, that's the first question they'd ask.
You mean within the US?
How does this happen?
Do you mean within the US or between the US and other countries?
Both.
Either.
I mean,
Okay.
it's the same.
Right.
It's the same
Okay.
issue.
I'll
Really.
draw you to a close there, just because in the interest of time, and I think it does connect with the first comment about geographical disparities that you mentioned. I'm going to cheat and add my own as well. Sorry to everybody, but I think this idea that it was a choice and not chance that we developed this middle class is strong, and you talked about a social infrastructure that supported that. That was the phrase you used, and we need to be more radical about that. Just in the interest of being provocative, it seems to me that you could argue that the political right has always resisted the idea that you need a social infrastructure, you just need a free market, but that the left maybe wants to just reinstitute the old social infrastructure that worked before, rather than create a new one. Would you agree with that way of framing it? And if so, what is the new social infrastructure that we should be pushing for and that you seem to want us to radically call for? So I won't summarize because you're a journalist, so you got all that. If you miss anything, I'll let you know.
Okay, so polarization. Well, first, thank you. I appreciate it. Polarization. So I guess there's a couple ways to answer that. One might be sort of a Marxist way, which would be that if you think about the sort of racial divisions that kind of prevent a certain working class solidarity in the United States, then if you were maybe to be able to build more of a class consciousness, that would, it'd be easier to overcome those racial divisions because you're working together on kind of collective economic project. But I think, maybe just kind of go back to the social infrastructure point, that one of the problems that I sort of think the country suffers from, and maybe a lot of countries suffer from, is kind of an erosion in the sort of social capital. It's kind of a Robert Putnam kind of argument, with that you used to have all these points of contact with people who weren't like you. That didn't mean that you suddenly liked everyone else that you engaged with, but because you had to engage with them in a human level, it was easier in some ways to share perspectives or develop empathy and things of that nature. And I think there has been an erosion in that in the United States that's contributed to political polarization. It's not the only thing that's going on. But to me, I think if we had institutions like labor unions, like other sort of other civic institutions don't necessarily need to have an economic sort of agenda, but if we had those things in place, maybe that would help bridge the gap. I don't know that it would, but it might. Certainly as a journalist who wants lots of people to read and believe what I write, it'd be nice if those things, if more people were willing to sort of listen to the other side. In terms of geographic differences, I think if you're talking about national borders, economists would probably say a lot of it comes down to institutions. You look at sort of North and South Korea, that's kind of the classic example. Some of it comes down to patterns in trade and things of that nature. But across borders and in particularly within borders, I think that we've become way too complacent and sort of are way too comfortable with the idea that technology wants what it wants, the economy wants what it wants, and we're kind of helpless to resist that. I don't think that's right. Now, to give you a few examples, one, it was never sort of a sure thing that the sort of Midwest and Northern Plains were going to develop in the way that they did. It took the construction of the Erie Canal, it took the construction of the railroads to open that land up and create the possibilities there. I'll say, again, the land-grant institutions, to me, just a phenomenal public investment in terms of putting institutions on the map that would help with local economic development, that would help with the diffusion of productivity from the places that were doing the innovating to the places that were using the technologies. So I think, one answer would be to sort of develop the confidence once again that we can influence the geographic distribution of economic activity. And then to Richard's point, I think you're probably right that a lot of people on the left are sort of probably see the solution to our problems in trying to recreate a lot of the social infrastructure that we had in the mid-century, and that's especially the case when it comes to labor unions. I'm a little more optimistic maybe than others about rehabilitating the labor movement. I think there's been an awful lot of hostile policy that's gone on over the last 40 years that's sort of taken us to where we are, and we could undo a lot of that if we worked on it. But I also think that we're going to have to come up with new social infrastructure, new social institutions, and it's not really clear to me what that's going to look like. I could speculate. I think at one point I might have said that social networks would allow us to communicate and organize and develop common interests and things of that nature. It seems clear that they're actually just hellholes. So I'm not really optimistic about that anymore. But I think technologically maybe there will be other ways to kind of organize and facilitate communication and kind of shared social goals.
Thank you. With that, we were out of time, but please join me in thanking Ryan for his address and for taking those questions.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.